Montana Territory, 1880, the wind howled low through the pine ridges as Lark Finley buried her husband with her own two hands. The earth was cold, hard, and stubborn, just like Luke had been. He had died the same way he lived, fast and too proud to ask for help. A horse threw him during a storm 2 weeks before her baby came. He was dead before she even screamed. And now, with the smell of wet pine in the air and the stillness of winter creeping in, Lark stood over the fresh grave, her newborn son swaddled tight against her chest. She named him Oliver. Because it sounded like hope, her nearest neighbor was 13 miles out. The cabin walls were thin and the woodpile was running low. The cow was dry. What little money she had was tucked into a jar behind the hearth, and food was already scarce, but she had no choice. She was 22, alone, and a mother now. 3 weeks later, after another snow and no visitors, she hitched her mule to the cart and bundled Oliver in a quilt. She had to get to town. She could trade something, maybe Luke's old rifle or the silver buttons from her wedding dress, anything to get flour and beans and maybe some milk for the baby. It was mid-afternoon when a sharp wheel crack stopped her cold. The cart tilted, then dropped. The rear wheel had split clean down the middle. "God," she whispered, her breath white in the air. She stepped down into the snow and tried to lift the axle, but it was no use. Her arms trembled under Oliver's weight. He whimpered softly, the cold already biting at his cheeks. That was when she heard hooves. She turned, heart leaping. The rider came up slow over the ridge, tall in the saddle, dark coat dusted in snow, hat low over his face. A rifle strapped to his back and a bay gelding under him. He reined in when he saw her, boots crunching over the frost as he dismounted. "You all right, ma'am?" His voice was low, steady, and warm. She held Oliver close. "Wheel's gone. I need to get to town." He stepped closer, his gaze falling to the baby in her arms. "You by yourself out here?" She nodded, wary but too cold and tired to hide it. He tipped his hat. "Name's Quillan Boyd. Folks call me Quill. I work cattle up past Bear Ridge. I'm Lark Finley," she said, her voice catching. "This is Oliver." Quill looked at the broken cart, then back to her. "You will not make it far on foot. Let me help you get to town. I can carry you both." She hesitated. "I give you my word," he added. "I just want to help." Lark studied his face. There was no edge to his eyes, no hunger or pity, just something honest. She nodded, slow. "All right." He helped her mount behind him, careful with the baby. She wrapped her arms around him, the smell of leather and pine sap close. Oliver was quiet, curled between them. They rode through snow-covered pines and open fields, the sky turning pink and heavy with dusk. Lark could feel the warmth of Quill's back through her coat, steady as a stove. "You sure you got no one else?" he asked gently. "My folks died of fever in '76, she said. "Luke was all I had, and Oliver." She looked down at her son, his tiny breath warm against her. "Yes." "Him too." They reached town as the lanterns were being lit. Quill helped her down, then reached for Oliver without asking. She hesitated but let him and watched as her baby settled into the crook of his arm like he had known him all his life. "I'll get what you need," Quill said. "You go rest inside." She started to protest, but he was already walking toward the mercantile, Oliver tucked against his chest like the boy belonged there. Lark sat by the stove in the small inn, her hands trembling as heat returned to her fingers. She did not know what to think. She had not expected anyone to stop, much less a man like him, quiet, kind, and sure-handed with a baby that was not his. Quill came back with bags of supplies and a small bottle of goat's milk. "I traded for the milk," he said. "And the rest, you do not owe me a thing." Lark looked at him. "Why would you do this?" He shrugged once. "Because no woman should be out there alone with a baby in winter. A beat passed. Stay the night," she said, surprising herself. "At least for supper." He held her gaze. "All right." That night they sat at a small table near the fire. Oliver slept in a basket by the stove. Lark made biscuits and stew with what he brought. They ate in a quiet rhythm, the kind that came easy. Quill told her about the cattle ranch and the long stretches of work. She told him about the cabin and the silence that pressed on her some nights until it hurt. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. She shook her head. "This land's all I have. Luke built that cabin. It may be small, but it is mine." He nodded. "Then maybe you just need someone to help you keep it." She did not answer, but something in her chest went warm and full. Quill stayed to help repair the cart the next morning, then he stayed to chop wood. Then 3 days passed and he had not left. He never said much about why. Just worked hard, held Oliver like he was made for it, and looked at Lark like she mattered. Then one night, as the stars burned cold and clear over the roof, Lark found him sitting by the cradle, watching the baby sleep. She stood in the doorway, hands clasped tight. "You do not have to stay, you know," he looked up. "I know. But you are still here." He stood, took a slow step toward her. "Because I choose to be." Lark's breath caught in her throat. "I know he has no father," Quill said, voice soft. "But maybe that does not have to stay true." Her heart pounded. "I never expected to feel this way," he said. "But I look at you and I see a life I want. I see him and I feel like I belong." Tears welled in her eyes. "I want to stay," he said. "If you will have me." Lark crossed the floor and took his hand in both of hers. "I want you to stay." And when he kissed her, it felt like the start of something real. Something good. Oliver stirred in his sleep, but did not wake. The wind outside had quieted. And inside, for the first time in a long time, everything felt warm. Early spring came stubborn and slow, dragging its heels through the mud and thaw. Quill stayed through the worst of it, his bedroll near the hearth and his hat always hung on the same peg by the door. He never asked for more than a place to lay his head and a plate at the table, but his presence settled into the cabin like a second heartbeat. One morning, while the sky was still silver with dawn, Lark found him outside, mending the chicken coop. A fox had gotten in the night before and feathers still clung to the wire and slats. He worked quiet, sleeves rolled, hands sure. Oliver stirred from the cradle behind her, just beginning to fuss. "You didn't have to start so early," she said, stepping out, shawl wrapped tight against the breeze. He didn't pause. It needed doing. She watched him a long moment. "You always fix what's broken." His voice was low. "Not always, but I try." Later, while Oliver sat gumming a strip of cloth Lark had soaked in water and tied into a knot, she sat with Quill as he whittled by the window. The shape in his hands hadn't taken form yet, just curls of pine falling to the floor. She traced a finger along the grain of the table. "Tell me something true about yourself," she said. He set the knife down. "I had a brother once, Saul, older than me by 3 years. He joined the Union cavalry in '63, didn't come back." She waited. "My father drank himself quiet after that. My ma died not long after. I worked my way west from Missouri, didn't count on staying anywhere long. But you stayed here." He nodded once. "Seemed like something worth staying for." That night, Lark let her hand rest against his as they sat by the fire. It wasn't a grand gesture. Just quiet, steady, like the way the wind brushed the cabin logs. He didn't speak, only turned his palm beneath hers and held it there. The next day, a rider came up the trail near noon. Lark recognized the shape of him before he even reached the gate. Mr. Hanley, who ran the feed store in town. He looked flushed, a telegram in his hand. "Came through the station early this morning," he said, breath visible in the cold air. "Figured you'd want to know." He handed it to her, then tipped his hat and rode off. Lark stared at the envelope, fingers trembling. Her name scrawled in heavy ink across the front. She opened it slow. The paper inside bore her sister's handwriting, tight, slanted, unmistakable. She hadn't thought of June in years. "They're coming west," she said aloud. Quill looked up from the porch. "Who is?" "My sister, her husband too, from Kentucky. Says they'll arrive by the end of May, looking to settle near Bozeman. You close. Used to be. But after I married Luke, we didn't write much." She never met Oliver. Lark folded the paper, her thumb pressing flat the creases. "She wants to see us." Quill leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You want that?" "I don't know." He didn't push. He never did. That evening, as twilight dropped soft over the valley, Lark lit a lamp and stood over Oliver's cradle. He was asleep, one fist curled against his cheek. She looked back at Quill, who was pouring water into the basin. "If they come," she said, "what will you say you are to us?" He straightened. "I'll say I'm the man who didn't walk away." She crossed to him, the lamplight catching the curve of her cheek. "That's what I'll say too." He touched her face then, thumb brushing just beneath her jaw. She leaned into it, eyes closing. They didn't speak again that night. But when she pulled the quilt over them hours later, her hand found his beneath the covers, and he held it until morning. By mid-April, the snow had melted to patches beneath the trees, and Lark's garden beds were readying for seed. Quill had built fencing around the edge of the property, saying nothing when she offered to help, just placing a hammer in her hand and pointing to the next post. One afternoon, as Oliver napped and the sun warmed the fields, Lark sat beside Quill at the edge of the pasture. "I read something once," she said. "In a book my mother kept, said love wasn't a feeling so much as a choice you keep making." Quill looked over at her, face unreadable, quiet in the way he always was when he was listening harder than he let on. "I didn't understand it then," she continued. "But I think I do now." He reached over, brushing his thumb along the back of her hand. "I choose you," she said, voice low, "not because of what you've done, but because of who you are when you do it." He didn't answer right away. Then, as the wind shifted and the grass bent low, he said, "Then I reckon I'll keep giving you reasons." They sat together until the sun dipped beyond the ridge and Oliver's cry carried from the cabin door, sharp and real and needing them both. Quill rose first, offering his hand. Lark took it without hesitation. The valley greened with the weight of April rains. Lark's hands stayed busy kneeling in damp earth, sowing rows of cabbage and onion, turning over soil until her palms were lined with grit. Oliver teethed hard through the week, fussing against her shoulder, his jaw hot from it. She tied him close while she worked, his cheek pressed to her collarbone, and hummed songs she hadn't thought of in years. Quill had taken to riding fence in the early light, checking for breaks where elk had passed through. When he returned, he'd pull his boots off at the door and bring in whatever he'd found, a handful of wild violets, a rabbit for stew, once a rusted horseshoe he said came up lucky. "You ever think about marriage?" she asked one evening as he stripped bark from a willow branch to make a rattle for Oliver. She kept her eyes on her stitching, not wanting to see the moment he flinched. If he did, he didn't. "I've thought about what it might be like," he said, "if it was with the right soul." She nodded, threading her needle again. "Luke never asked me neither, just said we were married and that was that. I didn't know any better then." "I'd ask you," Quill said quietly. She looked up. "I'd ask," he repeated, "but not if it'd feel like I was stepping over a ghost." "He's gone," she said, "and you're here, that's the truth of it." He set the rattle down and went to her. "Then I'll ask when your hands aren't full of thread and you ain't half watching a pot boil over." Her lips curved, but she said nothing more. He kissed her brow just once and went to check the fire. They built a new chicken run that week, one with tighter wire and a taller gate. Lark painted the posts white with leftover lime wash, and Quill carved a tiny O into the top rail near the gate latch. "For when he's big enough to chase hens," he said, "or feed them," she replied. "He'll have gentler hands than most." "I'll see to it." The day June came, the wind blew from the east and carried dust from the road. Lark saw the wagon before she heard its wheels. She set Oliver on her hip and stepped out into the yard, her heart lurching with every turn of the axle. June looked older. Not in years, but in the thinness of her face and the way she clutched her shawl like it might hold her together. Her husband, a tall man with a stiff collar and a store-bought hat, helped her down and kept a wary eye on Quill, who had come up from the barn. "You look just like Mama did," June said, stepping forward. Her voice cracked on the last word. Lark couldn't speak. She nodded, swallowed, and let her sister pull her into a tight, trembling hug. Oliver squirmed between them, pushing his hand against June's shoulder. "This him?" Lark shifted her son so June could see him better. "This is Oliver. He's got your eyes," June whispered. Quill stood back, hands at his sides, waiting. Lark turned slightly, her voice steady now. "This is Quill." He's with us." June's husband stepped forward, offering a nod but no more. "We're staying near Bozeman, took up a parcel, heard the soil's good up there." "It is," Quill said simply. They didn't stay long. June left a jar of peach preserves and a letter their mother had written years ago, tucked in a cloth case. She didn't say much about the years they'd missed, but when she hugged Lark again, tighter this time, she whispered, "I'm glad you found something better." After the wagon rolled away, Lark sat on the porch steps with Oliver asleep in her arms. Quill brought out 2 mugs of coffee, the kind she liked with a pinch of molasses stirred in. "She always sound like that?" he asked, passing her a mug. She used to laugh more, Lark said. Back when we were girls. Quill sat beside her, the boards creaking under his weight. You all right? I am. Just strange, seeing someone who remembers who I used to be. He sipped his coffee, then said, I only know who you are now, and I like her just fine. The sky burned pink above the trees, and somewhere down in the pasture, a bull elk called out low and long. I don't want to wait any more, she said, not looking at him. He turned to her. Wait for what? For you to ask. A moment passed. Then Quill stood, brushing the dust from his trousers. He looked down at her with something in his eyes she hadn't seen before, not softness, but certainty. Lark Finley, he said. Would you marry me proper? She rose, careful not to jostle Oliver. Yes, she said, without hesitation. He let out the breath he'd been holding, and she stepped into his arms. Oliver stirred but didn't wake. A week later, they stood under the cottonwoods behind the cabin, with Reverend Talbot from town reading from a worn prayer book. The wind wove through the tall grass, and the sun touched Lark's shoulders like a blessing. She wore her mother's brooch pinned to her collar. Quill had on the same coat he'd worn the day they met, brushed and mended. When the vows were spoken, he took her hand and kissed her knuckles one by one. I make you this promise, he said. Not just to you, but to him too. You won't be alone again. Lark's throat tightened. She pressed her forehead to his. The Reverend cleared his throat gently, but neither of them moved. That night, after the guests had gone and Oliver was asleep in the cradle, she and Quill sat at the table with a single candle flickering low. She reached for his hand. You're not just his father now, she said. You're my home. Quill looked at her like she was the only thing worth looking at and said, Then that's where I'll stay. By the time the last frost passed, Oliver had begun to crawl awkward and determined, swinging his legs in wide, uncertain arcs across the cabin floor. Lark padded the corners with wool blankets, kept the hearth cold during the day, and stitched soft leather guards for the chair legs so he wouldn't bruise himself. Quill made a small gate from pine slats, fixing it across the doorway so he could leave the cabin open without worry. In the mornings, Lark walked the length of the garden paths barefoot, dew wetting her toes. The air smelled of turned soil and green shoots. She carried Oliver in a sling across her back while she checked for beetle holes and pulled up weeds before they could take hold. Quill had begun shaping the barn's old tack room into something better suited for tool storage, and had plans to build a smokehouse once the ground dried enough to set the stones. One afternoon, as the sun lay heavy on her shoulders and the rows shimmered with heat, Lark stood up from thinning the carrots and shaded her eyes. Quill was at the edge of the field, shirt sleeves rolled, hammering a post into place. She watched the rhythm of his arms, steady and sure, and something inside her caught. Not the sharp ache of grief, as it had been, but a quiet fullness. A life being built one day at a time. She walked to him, brushing dirt from her palms. Do you miss being out on the range? She asked. He leaned against the post and looked toward the ridgeline. Sometimes, there's a kind of silence out there that sits deep in your bones. But that life doesn't hold much for a man who wants to stay put. You ever think you'll want to go back? I used to think I'd die in the saddle, he said, glancing at her. Now I think I'd rather watch my boy learn to walk. Oliver had crawled his way to the porch and was banging a wooden spoon against the floorboards, satisfied with the noise if nothing else. He's going to want a pony before he can talk straight, Quill added, nodding toward him. Lark laughed, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. You planning on saying no? Not likely. A breeze moved through the grass, lifting the scent of sun-warmed hay. Quill reached for her hand, rough fingers curling around hers. I've been thinking about building a second room, he said. Something with a window that faces the pines. She looked up at him. For us, for the child we might have next. The words settled between them like a promise. She didn't answer right away, just stepped closer until her forehead rested against his chest. His arms came around her and they stood like that, the wind weaving through the grass at their feet. Later that week, Quill rode down to the mill to trade for cedar planks. Lark stayed behind, Oliver asleep in a basket by the hearth. She took the time to mend a tear in Quill's coat and boil sweetgrass for drying. When the knock came at the door, she wiped her hands on her apron and opened it with caution. A woman stood just beyond the threshold, her hat pulled low, skirts dusty from the road. Her eyes were sharp, not unkind, but searching. "You Lark Finley?" she asked. "I am. I was told you married Quillan Boyd." Lark's fingers tightened on the doorframe. "That's right." The woman nodded once, then looked past her toward the cradle where Oliver stirred. "I'm his cousin, Ruth Boyd." "My pa was Quill's uncle." Lark stepped aside. "You'd better come in." Ruth didn't linger near the threshold, but moved with the ease of someone who wasn't a stranger to cabins like this. She sat by the window, untying her bonnet. Her hair was streaked with iron gray and her boots were worn near through. "I hadn't seen him since he was 15, she said. "Didn't even know where he'd gone until word reached us down in Kansas. What brought you all the way here?" Wanted to see with my own eyes the life he made. "There's been enough bad blood in our family to make a soul doubt anything good could come from it." Lark poured tea, the pot still warm from earlier. She set a cup in front of Ruth. "He doesn't talk much about where he came from," Lark said. "Likely no reason to." Wasn't much there worth remembering. Oliver woke and began to fuss. Lark lifted him gently, rocking him against her shoulder. Ruth watched them both. "He's a good man. That don't come easy in our line." Quill returned before dusk, his horse lathered and the cart stacked with lumber. When he saw Ruth standing by the fence, he stopped short. "I wasn't sure you'd remember me," she said. "I do." They stood across from one another for a long, silent moment. Then Quill stepped forward and wrapped her in a tight, brief embrace. "I heard about your father," he said. Ruth nodded. "I buried him last spring. He left me the farm, but I sold it. Can't work land on my own no more." "You got a place to stay?" "Not yet." Quill looked to Lark, who gave a quiet nod. "Then you'll stay here," he said. That night they ate cornbread and beans by lantern light. Ruth told stories Lark had never heard. How Quill had once broken his arm falling out of a hayloft, how he'd learned to shoe a horse before he could write his name. Lark listened, her hand resting over Quill's beneath the table. When the fire burned low and the plates were cleared, Ruth stood and stretched. "You found something good out here," she said. "We both did," Lark answered. Quill touched her back, low and steady. "We're just getting started." Outside, the moon rose over the pines, full and bright. Lark rocked Oliver against her chest, the rhythm slow and sure. Quill leaned beside her, one arm draped across her shoulders. The night was quiet, but not empty. Not anymore. The cedar planks were stacked neatly behind the cabin, their scent sharp and clean in the warming air. Ruth had taken to sleeping in the loft, her bedroll rolled tight each morning and set against the wall with a kind of practiced care. She kept busy, splitting kindling or plucking dandelions for tea, and never overstepped. One morning, Lark found her sitting at the edge of the pasture, sketching with a bit of charcoal on a scrap of muslin. The lines were simple fence posts, pine shadows, the curve of the hill, but they were steady and sure. "You draw often?" Lark asked, settling beside her with Oliver on her hip. "Not since I was a girl. Used to do it in the margins of my school books." She glanced at Lark. "Didn't expect to see this place again, not in any shape worth remembering." "You were here before." "Once, briefly. When Quill's father got too rough, my pa sent me up to help their ma pack. 4 days, maybe 5. Quill barely spoke then, just sat by the stove with a busted lip. Lark didn't reply. She only adjusted Oliver's bonnet against the sun and let the quiet settle. "You done right by him," Ruth said after a moment. "He's softer now, in the way a man ought to be when he's found something to hold on to." Lark nodded. "He doesn't hide anymore." Ruth folded the muslin and tucked it into her satchel. "I'll be riding on come Thursday. Got kin out near Helena." "They'll take me in." "You sure you don't want to stay longer?" "I've seen what I needed. You've made a place here. That's more than most folks ever get." That night, after Ruth went to bed, Lark and Quill sat on the porch with a kerosene lamp between them. The sky was clear, stars scattered sharp over the ridge. "She told me about your father," Lark said, keeping her voice low. Quill leaned back against the rail. "He never had much use for kindness. I'm glad you left. I had to. But I didn't know what I was looking for until I found you." Lark reached for his hand. "You've given Oliver something I never thought he'd have." Quill looked toward the cabin window where the baby's shadow stirred faintly behind the curtain. "He's easy to love." "So are you," she said. His hand tightened around hers. They married again the following Sunday, this time with just Ruth as witness and Reverend Talbot reading from a different page. Lark wore a dress she'd sewn from calico once meant for curtains, and Quill had trimmed his beard with a kitchen knife and Ruth's steady hand. Afterward, they ate cornbread with honey and passed around a tin of dried apples from Ruth's pack. She left the next morning, her saddlebag light but her shoulders easier. Lark stood in the doorway long after the dust of her horse faded, holding Oliver close and humming a tune she didn't remember learning. Through May, the cabin filled with a quiet rhythm. Quill built the new room, not with haste but with care, each joint fitted tight, each board sealed with pitch. Lark filled it with a cradle made from pine scraps and a small shelf for the tin rattle, now worn smooth from Oliver's hands. On the first warm evening of June, they sat beneath the cottonwoods with a plate of cold biscuits between them and their feet bare in the grass. "You ever think," Lark said, "we might grow old here?" "I do," Quill said, without looking away from her. "I think about it every day." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I want more children, not just for Oliver, for us." He kissed the crown of her head. "Then we'll have them, as many as you want." Fireflies blinked in the tall grass, and the breeze carried the smell of lilac and wood smoke. "I never thought I'd be happy again," she whispered. "You didn't just find happiness," he said. "You built it." They stayed outside until the stars came out, and when they went inside, they left the door open to let the warm air in. Years passed, not fast, but full. Quill built the smokehouse, then a small barn. Lark's garden doubled in size, and she taught Oliver how to water the rose without stepping on the roots. 2 more children came, a girl born during a summer thunderstorm, and another boy with hair like Quill's and eyes like hers. Ruth wrote twice a year, her letters short and neat, always ending with, "You were the good ending he needed." Oliver grew tall and quiet, favoring Quill's way of watching before speaking. Their daughter had Lark's laugh and a stubborn streak that showed up every time she was told no. The youngest followed his siblings like a shadow, pulling weeds and chasing chickens with equal delight. They never left the land. The cabin grew a little at a time, but the heart of it stayed the same. A fire always going, boots by the door, and the sound of children's feet on the floor. One evening, years after the garden first bloomed and the cedar boards still held their scent, Lark stood at the edge of the pasture with Quill beside her. The sun dipped low, casting gold across the field. Their children ran ahead, chasing something unseen, laughter catching on the wind. Lark slipped her hand into his. "I never thought I'd have this," she said. "You gave it to yourself," he said. "I just came along to hold it steady." She turned to him. "You stayed." "That's what love is," he said. Staying, the wind tugged at her skirt, warm and full of summer. And in that moment, standing beside the man she loved, watching the life they'd built stretch out before them in every direction, Lark knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. They never left. They never needed to. And they were happy every day for the rest of their lives.